Hello and welcome to Talk Human. How did you get into human factors? That's a pretty interesting question to ask anyone in our area. So we're going to explore the careers of two human factors specialists, myself included, and Gareth Walker. We've known each other for around 10 years now. He's the technical director at Famara Consulting. This is our very first episode, and we thought about getting into the nitty-gritty details of human factors. Instead, we thought it might be useful to go over us. How did we get into human factors? Where's our vision for the future? So grab a beverage, tea, coffee, or whatever fuels your professional growth. Settle in as we reminisce. All right, let's get into it, shall we? So, Gareth, where did you start in your journey of human factors?
I suppose I stumbled into it. My career started out with me aiming to be a psychologist. I thought, clinical psychology, something to treat people, make people better. I've often said, people get into psychology to fix someone else or fix themselves. Probably the second was true for me, but that's a subject for a different podcast. But yeah, after a while of doing psychology, trying to go down the clinical route, then the academic route, I found actually what I wanted was a way to apply it. The theory's lovely, but the real satisfaction for me was being able to see the impact of putting it to use. Seeing how things are actually improved by some changes, and psychology didn't really give me that in the end. I found that I was struggling to sort of get the satisfaction I wanted, and so I was sort of stumbling between different non-academic, non-professional jobs for a while.
A bus driver,
amongst others, which there's some psychology in driving buses as well, but again, that's a whole separate podcast. But eventually I did have an epiphany in the shower. I was on holiday in Wales with my family, and for whatever reason, when your mind has some idle moments, it sort of dwells on things, and it suddenly dawned on me, I thought, well, okay, if I want something that can apply psychology and maybe some other things I'm interested in, like design and engineering, hang on, what isn't ergonomics a thing? And that was literally the epiphany I had in the shower of, oh yeah, I've heard of ergonomics. Is it what I think it is? So once I was out of the shower and decent again, I did find a computer, did a bit of research, and then had that moment of, oh yeah, that works. And it went from there. I got myself onto the master's course at Loughborough, and then never looked back. I've had I'm trying to think how many years it is now. A long enough career that I can't remember how many years it is, which, it's worked out, I think. So, that epiphany was, it came at the right time.
Yeah, interesting. And when you first Googled ergonomics on the computer, what did you come across? Do you remember what you found?
I think you do get the usual thing of like, oh, here's an ergonomic keyboard, here's a chair, here's a sit-stand desk or something like that, which once you get past that and go, well, those things are lovely, but, that's not what I'm looking for. The academic course, the discipline, the sort of hub of human factors in Loughborough and that part of the country, that started to become a bit more noticeable, and it kept on cropping up again and again. Loughborough was the one that did feature the most for obvious reasons, and so unfortunately I had good enough grades to get in as well, and it was just a serendipitous thing, I suppose, that I found it, and it worked out.
Yeah, serendipity. I think that's a common word that I hear with human factors professionals. For me, there is some crossover in that I also wanted to understand how the human mind worked. Not a bit broader still, though. I also wanted to know how people worked in general. My interest stemmed from a love of making things as a kid, Kinect's toys, or in my dad's garage doing a bit of carpentry. Through to doing that at school as well. But, probably core part of my childhood was sport, and football in particular. And yeah, I remember moments where captain in the football team, it was part of my job to take the warm-ups, and taking the warm-ups, jogging around the pitch, doing the stretches, getting the body physiologically ready, which was something I found interesting. How do I get the most out of the team in that respect, but also psychologically? How do you get the team ready to compete at sport? And so when I picked my subject areas of biology and PE in particular, that was the reason why I really picked those things. But then, coming back to fate, and for me, there's been a few moments in my life, but didn't quite get the grade I needed for the Loughborough the Loughborough Human Biology course that I originally applied for in one of my mathematics A level. But fate came along and said, well, okay, you can't do the human biology course. How about doing the ergonomics course at Loughborough? And that's when I looked up ergonomics on the computer, came across the Chartered Institute's website on ergonomics and human factors, also looked at the brochure that came through and the Loughborough website. And yeah, there was that moment, that light bulb went on. This is actually what I want to do. I don't want to continue doing human biology, because the reason why I was doing that was anatomy and physiology, really. I enjoyed learning how the body worked. The biochemistry stuff was something that I was going to do as part of that. But yeah, understanding how people worked, but then applying it practically, another crossover with what you said, was exactly what I was looking for. And I was 18 years old at that time, never looked back. It's obviously we'll get into this, but it's been a fantastic career for me. So you started your ergonomics master's course at Loughborough University. How did you find that?
Well, it's a long time ago now. I barely remember it, but
how long ago are we talking?
Would have been 2007 that I started. So
okay.
I'm lucky if I can remember last week at this point. But it was a really interesting course in terms of the range of different things it covered. Having come from psychology, I've done obviously a lot of that as an area, but the anatomy, physiology, all those other aspects, the design side of things, was new to me. So that was really illuminating in terms of the range of things that you need to be thinking about as part of ergonomics and human factors. So, yeah, and it was a really educational thing, which is a daft thing to say about a piece of education, I suppose, but it was really eye-opening in terms of the different areas that make up one discipline, because it is so diverse. Psychology is a lot more narrow in terms of what it covers, because it is from your neck up, more or less. So the human factor side of things is the whole body as well as internal processes. It took a little bit of adjustment. Particularly the biology side of things, doing that at a master's level did not come easy to me. It was some long nights of not understanding an awful lot of it, but I got there in the end. It was a solid foundation for then the career that followed, which can't ask more than that, really.
Yeah, I had a flip reverse experience of that, having done biology, PE and mathematics, so a touch of psychology and PE, but that was certainly my weakest element of the human factors course. The bachelor's, the undergraduate course, so that was a 3-year course instead. But yeah, the human biology side of things, anatomy, physiology, statistics, I'd covered a lot of that stuff throughout my A levels. So going into it, psychology was my element I needed to catch up on instead, so flip reverse, as well as some of the design stuff as well. That was relatively new to me as well. But like you say, such a broad course. So just there I mentioned statistics, anatomy, physiology, design, psychology, and then ergonomics itself as a discipline. You've got cognitive ergonomics. There was a vision module. There's hearing, extreme environments modules. Really, really, really varied course. But that's what I loved about it so much. The variety of things that we needed to learn, but it all came back to a single point, which was understanding how people work and how do we then apply that to the design of whatever it is we're designing, products, systems. So for me, fascinating course and one that I thoroughly enjoyed. So you graduated, then what?
So that it was the start of my professional career, which took me to the world of defence, working on missile systems, so command and control, making sure that the missiles go to the right place. Obviously it's a high hazard industry. You don't want them flying around willy-nilly. They need to go specifically where they're intended. And there are some really complex aspects to that, but the human factors integration side of the defence sector was really quite a good education of the process, the way you've got to consider so many things, and the way that it is structured systematically to make sure that when you're planning a project or developing a system, it covers everything it needs to. And that holistic is probably not the right word in terms of defence, but that consideration of all of those factors, it's something that's been carried through into everything I've done since, because every time you look at any system, whether it is defence or latterly medical, you need to understand context. You can't just look at a device in isolation. You need to understand where it's going to be used, who it's going to be used by, all of those things. So defence really was a fantastic foundation for that, and it has other aspects as well which were good. More for the fact I've been able to leave behind later, the incredibly slow timescales and bureaucracy. But fortunately now I can look back on that fondly, and because I don't have to deal with it anymore. But likewise, you started out in defence as well. I'm sure some of this is familiar to you.
Yeah. I will skim over the bit. I did a placement year in distribution with Next, the clothing company. But yeah, going back to that in a bit. But yeah, I graduated, and my first graduate job was with Lockheed Martin in the defence industry. Command and control as well, but an airborne early warning system, meaning a helicopter with a variety of sensors on board, including radar, that take a tactical picture over a 300-mile radius, and then command and control from that point. So operators in the back of the helicopter looking at a variety of different screens with one screen in particular, the primary screen, amalgamating a variety of different sensor signals into hopefully one clear picture for the operator to interpret. Much similar things to what you said there. Defence was very robust. The processes were well developed. Been in that industry for human factors had been applied in that industry for a long time. I think it was around 80 years at the time. So I found it to be a really good, strong starting point in terms of, okay, I've learnt the theory of human factors. Now, how is it applied in a process? That was probably my biggest learning curve as a human factors specialist, is how do you take the theory and then apply it in a way that fits to a process. Other than that, it was an exposure to performance. How do we improve human performance through the designer systems? There was a heavy focus on that, as you can imagine. Things like situational awareness are really important. It just set me up for a future career in terms of producing robust documentation as well. I remember sitting on a day course on how to format a Word document. How do you do headers, footers, page numbers, all in the way that they wanted it, specific ways. And then how do you upload that into an electronic management system? So, all these things that you don't learn in your academia, but are very important skills nonetheless, and skills I've carried forwards with me. Going back a step, Next and distribution, that was an interesting experience as well. Yeah, the opposite in many other ways, because they didn't have an internal human factors specialist. Lockheed Martin had a team of experienced human factors specialists for me to learn from, but Next, it was a case of, okay, you've done 2 years of theory, let's throw you into a workplace environment and let you wing it. That was a fantastic experience in itself, because it got me to think critically. Okay, we're in this environment of distribution, which includes a lot of human beings, robots, and a lot of automated systems as well. So as you can imagine, there are a lot of interfaces between the human and the machine. It meant I needed to go back to the toolbox that I'd developed at that moment in time and go, well, what have I got here? How can I help in this situation? Sue Hignett had done a module which included link analysis before I'd gone into that workplace, and I managed to do a link analysis on a packing area. So parcels or items would come down on a chute that needed to be put into a parcel. That parcel would go into a pigeonhole, and then that pigeonhole would become a customer, and that bag would go off into a pallet, and that pallet would go into the truck. But there was this moment where the user, the operator, would have multiple items coming down the chute. They need to quickly recognize what pigeonhole to put them in. And it meant the human was doing a lot of back and forth from chute to pigeonhole. Pigeonholes were scattered around. But yeah, via doing task analysis first, looking at what tasks, the steps they needed to do to complete that job. Then also looking at the objects they were interacting with, the chute, the pigeonholes, a computer system, a scanner, and then mapping the objects with the tasks to try and come up with a much more efficient way of doing things, which, I was quite proud to say that theoretically, this was an interesting lesson, theoretically, what I'd come up with was better. It saved around £80,000 per year across a system of 140 stations, packing stations. Went to the director, very, very proud of myself at the time. He looked at it and went, that's great, but the cost of making all of these changes and the delay in it would take to implement these changes is far outweighed by the saving. So that was my first lesson in you can come up with great ideas, but unless if they're practical, unless if they're going to work with the constraints that you're working with, and in this instance it was timeline, which was one of the most important factors, then it doesn't really matter what your recommendation is. It's not going to work in the real world. So yeah, that was an important lesson to learn in that respect.
And being thrown in at the deep end like that, you have to learn quickly.
Yeah, 100%. And I think there was a lot of value in that as well. It's useful to have someone around when you're first starting who can guide you through what you're supposed to do. But I think equally there's a lot of lessons learned in trial and error, quite frankly. But yeah, when you first started, how did you find the experience of being a graduate and then going into, I imagine it was a much more experienced team at MBDA?
Yeah, there were a lot of very experienced people there already. They had a wealth of knowledge between them. They were very supportive. They didn't take me under their wing so much as just give me a little bit of space to make those mistakes that you need to just get out your system, or you need to get your head in the right place to think about the right way to do things. And they gave me that space, but then also gave me the support when I needed it to build that capability. And it was quite a diverse team in terms of background. So it was interesting to see how everyone approached every problem from a slightly different perspective, which is something that had been true across the rest of my career in HF, because everyone does come at this from a different starting point. So they bring their own approach, their own background, their own experience to it, and so it was a good illustration of how, in fact, there's a right way and a wrong way, but the right way, there's quite a few different right ways within it. So, as we've found over our career since, you and I could do things differently but get the same good results, and it doesn't mean that you have to do it exactly one way. That you tailor it to the way that suits you. So you work with your strengths, and so the defence experience was really handy there to understand what my strengths were, conversely what my strengths weren't, and build on what I could, but equally work with that knowledge to try and improve and maximise my potential.
Yeah. And so how long was you at MBDA? Was that your last place of work in defence? And then what made you move on from there?
So it was around 5 years that I spent down there. That was my only career, well, part of my career in defence. The transition came just over time that I always sort of a bit wary about how I describe this, because it's very easy to make it sound like I'm incredibly dismissive or critical of defence. I began to realise it wasn't the right fit for me. I came to understand that if I did my job perfectly, somebody dies, which is the nature of defence, and that is in no way a criticism of people who are doing it. It's just not what I wanted out of my career. So when the opportunity came to move out of that industry and into medical, that was the right step for me, because then with medical devices, if you do it right, hopefully somebody lives, which is the more comfortable way around for me. It was just a more natural fit, and I got to the point where I was a little disenchanted with what I was doing in defence because of all of that. And then jumping the fence, coming into medical, it was eye-opening. It's like, oh yeah, it can be the way I want it to be. I can have a more tangible and positive impact on people, and that was a sort of satisfying change, and I've not really looked back, and I'm still doing medical devices however many years later this is. I really should have worked the sums out before we started this conversation.
So you went from MBDA into where was your next job?
So worked for a company called Owen Mumford over in Woodstock, near Oxford. They do medical devices, primarily drug delivery devices, a few other associated items as well, and they work on behalf of a range of clients. They have their own product line, but then also they'll work for pharma companies developing devices for them. So working mostly in that drug delivery space, so auto injectors, pen injectors, capillary blood samplers, things like that, across quite a few different projects. So I was with them for 3.5 years, and by the time I left, I think I had 28 projects on the go. So most of them were just a watching brief, but definitely a nice range of challenges, and it also helped hone my ability to multitask.
28 projects is quite a lot, even just to keep an eye on. It's headspace, isn't it? And I think at this moment in time, roughly speaking anyway, our parallel timelines, you was moving into Owen Mumford as I was moving into automotive, into Jaguar Land Rover, which was a very different way of applying human factors to what I'd previously done in defence. There was still an element of performance, driver safety, driver distraction. That was a big part of what we had to keep in mind. But 50% of my role was blue sky thinking, as in where will the automotive industry be in 10, 15, 20 years' time. Half of my role was split into still early stage development, so ideas that would be ready to be implemented into the next vehicle cycle. So, the things we were thinking of were then maybe 5 years ahead, But it was mostly around user experience, therefore, because it was how do we generate new ideas that's going to ultimately sell more premium vehicles. So much more focus on user experience. How do you get someone to fall in love with a vehicle? How do you generate that user satisfaction? And a lot of the testing that we were doing was rapid. It was, iterative design. It was taking concepts that were made out of a shed and putting them in front of users. Users is an important topic. We've gone from defense, where I was designing for very niche specialist operators, maybe 12 in the country, of which 2 were co-designing with you, coming on site and telling you about what the tasks, what the job involved. Whereas with Jaguar Land Rover, anyone over a certain age can drive with a driving license. Things like impairments, limitations, they're limited because they need to be able to drive. So the users were very, very different, a lot broader in a lot of respects, especially like cognitively, for example. And we had to think about negative transfer from one vehicle to another. But just a very different experience to designing at Lockheed Martin. But I thoroughly enjoyed it there as well. It was a chance for me to stretch the creative side of human factors. It can span a lot of different things, can't it? Hopefully we're going to talk about this in a future episode, but human factors and user experience, what's the difference? Are they the same thing? So my role at Jaguar Land Rover stretched the boundaries of what human factors is into that UX kind of remit. I was there for a relatively short period of time before making my way into the medical device industry as well. So
And I think coming back to you, I think this was around the same time we both landed into Smith and Nephew, within about a year of each other. So tell me about Smith and Nephew and how you decided to make that move from Owen Mumford.
That was another sort of opportunity of chance, I suppose. So much of my career is just happening upon an opportunity without a real plan. There was an opportunity in the wound care sector. There were a few different companies that were beginning to understand they needed to consider human factors because there had been some unfortunate events around wound care in use. So the FDA particularly were scrutinising in ever greater levels. So there's the human factors list of high priority reviews from the FDA, and drug delivery devices were on that. But then wound care made its way on as well, and so Smith and Nephew plus a few other companies were beginning to look in that. We're beginning to look for some expertise in that area, and the opportunity came up, and I thought, yeah, that suits me. I can go for that. It was also driven by some of the convenience that I was living down near Oxford at the time, and I was trying to save up for buying a house, and unfortunately, Oxford being what it is, all my savings would have bought me a cardboard box in a doorway, whereas Hull is a little bit more affordable. So I came up here and managed to set myself up in a house, and that's just made life a lot easier in terms of it's just one less thing to be worrying about. So that sort of less work-related factor also helped make that decision for me. But the transition into wound care was really interesting because when you look at wound care as a sort of at a superficial level, you think, oh, that's not going to be very interesting. It's just going to be a wound. Well, what's involved in that? But when you get into the world of negative pressure wound therapy, there's a lot of complexity with that and risk that goes with it. The scrutiny from the FDA came from people dying through exsanguination, bleeding out because of negative pressure on flawed device. That's a tactful way of describing it, isn't it? And so, yes, that risk, it makes it important that it is used correctly. But again, it's that very broad range of uses, particularly with any home use system. It could be anyone, basically above a certain age. And normally when you've got the kind of wound that requires negative pressure, you're not in the best of shape anyway, so you're maybe not thinking that clearly. So the scrutiny around ease of use and use safety just needs to be that much more rigorous to make sure that people in that situation aren't making the mistakes that are going to be really consequential. Mistakes happen, but you need them to be recoverable. You need them to not kill people, and so that's why the wound care side of things actually kept me. That's probably the longest part of my career, I suppose, has been working in that, because it was really important that you got it right.
Yeah.
How about you? How did you find the opportunity? And
for me, it was another fate moment. I had already met my now wife at this moment in time, so this was a lot more than 10 years ago now. She lived in Hull. The standards and the guidance had been newly released, and like you said, there was problems with wound care in market that they were particularly scrutinising. I was looking for work in the area at the time, so that I could be starting a life with my partner. And the job at Smith and Nephew came up. But the other thing that was going on in my life at that moment in time, my mum had been diagnosed with ovarian cancer. I'd already spent a few years seeing that journey, and therefore interactions with medical devices that come with it. And so for me, this sort of fate moment, two strong drivers for me going for that job. So obviously applied for it, and like you, I stayed there for the longest time I have spent in a job, nearly 7 years there. And I remember going for the interview at the time, and there was clearly pressure on pardon the pun, pressure on the wound care side of things, the negative pressure wound therapy side of things. And so there was a heavy focus on regulations, meeting those regulations, proving safety and efficacy. With my degree and my previous experiences, I knew that we'd be able to go beyond just ticking those boxes. I wanted us to start doing studies internally, start doing more research internally, and really getting to grips with human factors, user experience, user-centered design, whatever you want to call it. How do we make sure that as a department, the user is central to that design process? Prior to that, it was very much an engineering-driven focus or biology-driven focus. So how can we develop technical innovation in order to develop new products, rather than combining that with what does the user actually need here? And it was, as you know, there was a few projects where it was driven purely by technical innovation because we could do it. Technically, it was the reason why we did do it as an R&D project for several years with millions of pounds spent, only to really find out, that maybe there wasn't a strong user need for it after all. And that became very much it was a personal mission for me, actually, was to try and change that for R&D, to try and bring user-centered thinking into the design process. So that's what kept me going for 7 years, along with the things you mentioned about the importance of human factors in negative pressure wound therapy. But for me, it was probably one of the proudest moments of my career, was changing a culture to one that was thinking about human factors. And was getting involved early in projects. We was getting involved in the innovation side of things, as well as the development and the validation side of things. So thoroughly enjoyed my time there. It was a brilliant experience, and rounded off my experience as a human factors specialist. So what was the most proud moment of your career at Smith & Nephew?
There were quite a few proud moments over my time there, but I think the one I look back on with the most pride is going over to the robotics division in Pittsburgh and setting up the human factors capability there. The company over in Pittsburgh was a small startup that had been bought by Smith & Nephew, so they had that startup mentality, but didn't necessarily have the knowledge in terms of things like human factors and how it needs to be integrated into those kind of systems. And it was a wonderful opportunity. It had its challenges as well. Obviously, it's that journey of creating the right mindset in people's thought process as they're developing systems. Like you were describing, it is a gradual thing, and within 6 months I managed to make good progress, but obviously it is a long process, so I won't take I won't claim the whole achievement to myself, because I set the foundation, but then other people have carried it on. But I'm proud of how I was able to throw myself into that situation, learn the complexities of surgical robots, which was a knee surgery system, and obviously we're back into that sort of anatomy and physiology realm that wasn't natural to me, but I've picked up over the years. And also the cultural side of things, going over to America, the different way of working over there, all of those challenges, being able to take that on and do a reasonably good job with it, the traditional English modesty on it. But I think that's probably one of the things that I was most pleased about in terms of my time at Smith & Nephew, but then also was really useful for after I left Smith & Nephew, because I was able to then take those skills in terms of surgical robotics and harness them in my next role, which was for CMR Surgical down in Cambridge, working on their minimal access surgery. So a whole keyhole surgery robot, basically, is the sort of simplified version of that. And they were also a relatively young company, so again needed that assistance in terms of formalising the human factors approach, because they had a great team of people there, but it was that transition from the user-centered design into the more formal regulatory end of human factors that they were lacking the knowledge in, and where, because I had that, I was able to come in and help that out. And since then they have managed to get FDA clearance. They're going to the American market now, and so again I can look on that with pride as well. And
Yeah, big achievement. Yeah.
yeah, and I think the theme across all of my career is it's always that high hazard, high scrutiny, high risk part of human factors. So it's nice. Nice is not the right word, but it's good to have that pressure that comes from if goes wrong, something bad happens. I think that helps motivate me to understand the consequences of what we're doing and provides that impetus to make things better, because I've always been driven by that passion that things should be better. Sometimes it's more annoyance than passion, just annoyed why isn't it better. But being able to harness that into a career, and particularly in the medical sector where things being substandard has real human consequence, being able to address that improves lives for many people. I'm not clever enough to be a doctor, but in my way, I feel like I've had an influence on people's healthcare journeys and made some people's lives better. Well, at least I'd like to think I have. I haven't tried doing the sums, but it gives me some satisfaction knowing that that's what I've been able to achieve.
Yeah, something that we both have in common is that continually looking for how do we make things better for people? How do we improve the lives of patients and also the healthcare professionals using these medical devices? And yeah, it's something that you can continually aim for, and that's a privilege in itself, isn't it? So yeah, we've covered most of your career up to obviously the move to Famara Consulting. How has your approach to human factors evolved over that time, would you say?
I would say it's matured. I think naturally, as you get older, your approach to these things develops with age and experience. You begin to understand where the compromises can be made and where they can't, where you need to draw a line and where you can have a bit of wiggle room. And that comes back to your conversation earlier about the improvements. If you can't justify them, that they're not going to happen. Yeah, so being able to see that more pragmatic side of human factors, it's easy, particularly early in your career, to be idealistic and go, everything needs to be as good as it possibly could be. Everything needs to be perfect. But as you spend a little time trying to make that happen, you realise that perfect is kind of hard to achieve, and so better is an improvement. So that's a good starting point. And I think that has cemented over my journey through human factors. I've always been quite a pragmatic person, but then having it reinforced by that experience, and then seeing the other side of things where compromises are compromised too far. We've all had those conversations on projects where you go, oh, I think this will be all right, and then a few months later you go, nope, that wasn't, was it? Oh, I wish I could wind that back. Which is part of the journey, isn't it? Learning the hard way sometimes. And yeah, having had those experiences as well, it helps cement a picture of where those lines are and where the compromises can and can't happen. And that shapes my approach to all my work these days, knowing what I want to achieve, but equally the best way of doing it and an effective way of getting there.
Yeah, one word I'll pick up on there is compromise. And for me, developing a device, or almost any device for that matter, there is compromise throughout that process. You're compromising between what is the best from a usability perspective or mechanical perspective, transit perspective, whatever it is. But knowing the right compromises to make along the way, I think, is one of the things that you can develop over time. And by staying in a particular industry as well. So my transition personally from industry to industry, the human didn't change, like in terms of the fundamentals of anatomy, physiology, psychology, the scientific disciplines behind understanding people didn't change. It's a better way of saying it. But what did change was the constraints that you're working with, those technical constraints. And by spending more time in a particular industry, you more experience in terms of what those compromises should be. Sometimes that does mean maybe you do need to compromise on a particular aspect of usability that is the real world. And then other times it's knowing when to stand up and say, actually, no, on this particular thing, we can't compromise. That is just not, from a safety and efficacy standpoint, we can't compromise on that. So yeah, it's navigating those, and that comes with time. It comes with experience as you go through your career. In terms of soft skills, what have you found in terms of how do you make human factors have a meaningful impact on the design of products?
I think it fundamentally comes down to, well, we all often talk about speaking the user's language when we're designing devices, but equally when you're negotiating or discussing things with engineers or commercial or other stakeholders, you need to be talking the right terms. You need them to understand the message. So when it comes down to it, you have to phrase it in a way that makes sense and resonates with their interests. And over our careers, I suppose we have both had to learn that translation, the way that what we think means the most to us can then be phrased to somebody else in a way that should mean something to them.
So coming to the end of the show now, but one final question. What advice would you give to new human factors professionals besides don't panic?
Oh man, that's a pretty good bit of advice there, but I'd say the main thing is to stay curious and don't be afraid to ask the stupid question, because so many times, you see people join and they think, oh, I need to demonstrate everything I know. But actually, that's not really what you need. You need to get the knowledge out of somebody else most of the time. Anytime you're talking to a user or even colleagues, they tend to know an awful lot more about the subject than you do. So asking the right questions, and sometimes weaponizing your lack of knowledge is the most powerful thing you can do, because I've had conversations with an orthopedic surgeon or someone like that where they know so much about their discipline and they forget that the person they're talking to doesn't. And so occasionally you just have to say, I don't understand anything you're saying. Can you explain that to me very simply? And then you get an interesting narrative from them when they're having to think these things through. And you sometimes get information that you wouldn't have got otherwise. So being able to use what some people would consider a weakness, the lack of knowledge, you turn it into a strength. And I think that's a really valuable tool and it doesn't change even now, 18-ish years later, however long it actually is. I really should do that number of calculation. But I still do that because I have come to learn that I don't know everything, so why not make the most of that lack of knowledge?
Wow. Yeah. Fantastic advice, and what a way to close up the end of today's show. Thank you very much for listening. In our next show, we will go into why I started Famara, why Gareth decided to join in on a crazy adventure, what the transition was like from manufacturer, which we've spoken about today, to consultancy, and what we want to achieve in the future. Please follow our channel to receive updates on future shows, and tell us how you got into human factors or your current role if you're not a human factors specialist. Was it fate or was it fully intentional? Finally, we'd love to know if you fancy being a guest on the show. My email address will be in the show notes. You've been listening to Talk Human. Thank you very much.